It's time to huddle up. I'm Garrett Seawright. Thanks for making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you are watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, give us a thumbs up. It goes a long way in helping the channel. If you're listening on the podcast, leave a 5-star review. Tell your friends about us. It certainly goes a long way in helping grow Saturday Glory, the daily huddle, Sunday through Thursday. And would love to have your interactions, your thoughts. Hit me up on Twitter at Garrett Seawright, 2 R's and 2 T's, and let's have a conversation today. The USA Today compilation of all of the college football financials is at the top of my mind because when you look at the donations by school, and this is just public school by the public schools, so there is no, there is no Duke, there is no Northwestern, Baylor, etc. So I think that's an important caveat. So the numbers of what the financial contributions and donations from boosters to schools has come out from 2005 to 2022. And USA Today has compiled them basically 1 through, I think, 110 of here's how much everybody has got. And there are some takeaways that it's interesting. I think that you would be able to guess in the top 10. I would guess you would probably get 6 of the top 10, 7 of the top 10. There are a couple that when you see them in originally, you think like, whoa. One, I can't believe that school's not in the top 10, or some of these schools are not in the top 10, but then also some of them don't sound like schools that you would think would have top 10 level booster funding until you go, oh, okay. That makes a little bit of sense. So number 1 is Oregon, and $969 million from 2005 to 2022. And I think that fits into the, oh, that makes sense with one guy, Phil Knight, dropping some money. Yeah, that tracks. But it's number 1, nearly $1 billion in 17 years, just shy of $1 billion. Number 2, I don't think is all that shocking, but it's still $120 million less. Is Texas A&M. A&M has taken in $849 million. And when you, like, cynically, when you see some of these figures, it's like, man, it's an awful lot. Like, there are billions and billions of dollars in the last 17 years on college sports and specifically college football that can turn you somewhat cynical that, man, there were $283 million at Cal. There are a lot of things that could have been done that weren't and still aren't. So Oregon and A&M take the top 2 spots. Texas is number 2, or I beg your pardon. Texas is number 3, just a few $1 million more than Florida, who is at 4. Georgia is at 5. Oklahoma State is at 6. And like Oregon, Oklahoma State, I think if you were walking down the street and would ask somebody, hey, do you think Oklahoma State is in the top 6 in athletic boosters? No, probably not. And then you're like, oh, wait, T. Boone Pickens existed. And that all makes a lot of sense now. But $670 million is a lot of dough. And you find somebody who loves your university and has a lot of money. Oregon and Oklahoma State are Exhibit A and Exhibit B of, hey, here's how you can benefit. LSU is 7. Oklahoma is 8. Auburn is 9. And Florida State is 10. So what stands out to you? Because what stands out to me is there are some big schools in there. There are some big-time football programs that are not listed in that top 10. Ohio State is 11. Alabama is 12. When you equate college football success, you don't get to 11 and 12 for Ohio State and Alabama. Michigan is 15. Tennessee is 14. Clemson is 17. So there are some really big schools, really successful schools in spots 11 through 20. So the question that I left after reading this list was, which came first, the success or the money? And I feel like you can make a case for both, because obviously Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson have been super successful on the field while getting frankly dwarfed in donations. Auburn boosters gave $580 million from 2005 to 2022, and Alabama gave $528 million. So you're looking at a $50 million difference, which over the course of 17 years isn't that big of a gap. And frankly, some of that booster contribution could be to offset some coaching hires at Auburn that you haven't had at Alabama. But which came first, the success or the money? I would argue the success, because when you look at the top 10 money wise in the last 10 years, there's 3 national champions in that list, and 2 of them are Georgia. So the idea that, and I've never bought the idea, because there's consternation in college football fans that if my school is not going to be a major player in NIL, we are going to be a have not. And I don't buy that to a point where, yes, if your school is giving nothing, if your boosters are giving nothing to players, yes, you are probably going to be a have not. It's a bad situation for Army, Navy, and Air Force. You are already kind of fighting with one arm tied behind your back, and now everybody else can give even a little bit of scratch, and you can't. So, yes, you're going to be at a disadvantage. But for every kid who is going to chase the bag, and I have no qualms with bag chasing. If you are going to go get your money, go get your money. Capitalism, baby. We love it. For every kid that's going to go chase that bag, there are probably 2 to 3 to 4, and maybe that number's bigger, of kids who are going to choose the right fit, the right academics, the right chance for playing time, the right relationship with a coach, proximity to home, whatever the case may be. So while some of the big fish are going to search for where can I get the most money, there are still kids that care about who is going to get me to the league. Because it matters. It's always mattered. It's going to continue to matter as much as getting checks from boosters matters to some kids. And it's, there's not a right or wrong. It's just different. Your perspective is different. Your priorities are different, and that's okay. But for every kid who's going, how can I get the most money to play in college? There's somebody else whose focus is, how do I go to the program that is going to put me in the NFL? And it's just a, how do I get money now versus how do I get more money in the future? And that's all it is. So for the schools who think, for Arkansas, who's in 32nd place, and I'm sure that there are Razorback fans going, oh my gosh, we only gave $324 million, the same as Kansas State. How can we compete in the SEC? Well, you put together coaches who want to be there, and you put together a program that utilizes talent differently than, I'm a firm believer, and we'll probably talk about this at some point in a different episode, that there are just some schools and some conferences that can't just line up and do what everybody else is doing. So back in the day when Mike Leach went to Texas Tech and said, hey, guess what? We're going to chuck a pigskin every play because we can't line up in the I formation and beat Texas and A&M and Nebraska. Made a lot of sense. When Paul Johnson took the triple option to Georgia Tech, because you know what? Joe Tiller at Purdue. We're going to chuck a pigskin around because we can't just line up in the I formation and run the football and push people against their will from Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, and Wisconsin. It wasn't going to happen. So you got to do something different. And there are some schools that you just got to do something different at. I would argue that in the Big Ten, that Indiana and Purdue are schools that you have to do something different. Obviously, in the American Athletic Conference, Navy, Air Force, Army are schools that you have to do something different in. Texas Tech, I think, is the perfect example in the Big 12. Mike Leach had it right. You can't go in there and do what everybody else is doing and just try to move people against their will, because the bigger, faster, stronger kids aren't probably going to go to your program. So you got to do something different. I think Mike Leach again at Washington State, similar situation. Is Washington State going to out recruit Washington, Oregon, USC, UCLA? No, probably not. You got to figure out a way to win with less. And then there are some schools who probably think we got to figure out how to win with what we got, like Texas A&M. You got $849 million in donations from boosters, and what do you have to show for it? Not a lot. Oregon at least has played in the national championship game twice. Texas A&M, ugh. Texas, since 2005, had a nice run of success. But when you look at, and this is why I think proves my point of the success came first. And on the flip side, how apathy and just pure indifference can be a game changer and a killer. From 2005 to, what is that, 2012, Texas was as good as anybody. And Texas has built a strong brand, and they've got rich benefactors, and they are every reason why you should get millions and millions of donations. But it just proves that you're not going to buy your way to a title. And going back to the argument of, my NIL, my school can't compete at NIL, we don't have a chance. If money was the only thing that mattered, then the New York Yankees and the Los Angeles Dodgers would play every year in the World Series. And they don't, because chemistry matters and motivation matters. And there are so many other factors into just whoever can buy the best roster. Does it play some role? Of course it does. Of course it does. I can't pretend that there aren't, especially in college basketball, some schools that are just ponying up to, hey, we'll just rebuild this roster and we'll do it in the transfer portal and NIL. And that's okay. Different strokes for different folks. But if money was all that mattered, Oregon State and Texas A&M would play each other in the national championship game every year. And they don't, because there are other variables at play other than money. But when you look at some of these schools, I think the timeline is interesting from the 17 years. Because, so for instance, Ohio State and Alabama, for the most part, in those 17 years, have been pretty steady. Oklahoma, LSU have been pretty steady. Iowa, which brought in $1 million more in donations and contributions than Clemson did, has been pretty steady. Clemson in those 17 years has been pretty steady. South Carolina has seen wild fluctuations. Louisville has seen wild fluctuations in their college football programs. Virginia is number 13. A national basketball championship probably helps that number. Tennessee is right at $500 million. And Tennessee's basketball team has been pretty good on and off in those 17 years. And their football program has been really, really good at times and really bad at times in those 17 years. But there are some other takeaways that I just thought, if I were to ask you, hey, where do you think Nebraska lands on this list of the highest public school donations and contributions to their athletic department from 2005 to 2022? Where do you think Nebraska falls? Because it's probably not number 42, which is where they fall. Nebraska is below Iowa State and slightly above UCLA. And part of this, I wonder, is at a school like Nebraska, where, and this is not, Nebraska fans are as passionate as you will find. And for the most part, they are not passionate / unreasonable, which makes them really likable because they know, hey, we're just doing our best and we're going to support the Big Red no matter what. Now, at the same time, was Mike Riley a nice guy who just wasn't a very good football coach for us? Yes. Was Scott Frost a very good football coach for us? No. They're somewhat reasonable. And I told you in the introduction episode, I will do everything I can to not be unreasonable because I just don't like it in my personal life. I don't like unreasonable. I don't like illogical. And there are some fan bases that are unreasonable or illogical, and we're not going to name them today, but we'll get there during the college football season. But Nebraska is not that. But I wonder if, they sell out Memorial Stadium every Saturday. And I wonder if that is just their fan base is like, hey, I'm supporting the program. I'm giving my money for tickets. Show up on Saturdays, cheer my heart out. And I don't have $848 million to give to the Nebraska athletic program. But $236 million is nothing to shake a stick at, but it's 42nd. And when you have this long run of not meeting expectations, is that people, quote unquote, voting with their wallets, so to speak, of I don't support Bill Callahan, Mike Riley, Bo Pelini, Scott Frost? Or is it just a circumstance of I don't have millions of dollars to give this program? Because when you think of the Blue Bloods in college football, it's not far until you get to Nebraska. But when you look at they're getting beat in contributions by Arizona State and Texas Tech and West Virginia and Virginia Tech and Ole Miss, Cal brought in more. And it's an argument from people in the Midwest all the time. Why in the world is the Big Ten adding USC and UCLA? People in California don't care about football. People in California don't care about sports. Cal brought in more than Nebraska did. Nebraska barely brought in more than UCLA did. The spot of Nebraska at 42 is, again, one of those chicken and the egg. Was it a lack of success that led to low donations? Basketball program hasn't been good. Baseball program's pretty good. Volleyball program is outstanding. Football program has not been great. Or is Nebraska seeing a downturn in football success where they haven't finished in the top 25 in a decade because they're 42nd in donations in just public schools? I would guess that USC is probably above Nebraska in this list, that Duke is probably above Nebraska on this list. I don't think it's far-fetched to think that Baylor is above them in this list. So that's 45 when you start throwing in private schools. And that's just a couple off the top of my head. So which came first, the chicken or the egg? Was it they stink? And I don't think they stink. And I think Matt Rule will do a really good job there. Unfortunately, I thought Scott Frost would do a really good job there too. So we'll circle back around to that in a couple of years. But I think Matt Rule is a really good guy for that job at this point in time. But do they finish 42nd in spending because they have seen a downturn in success, or have they seen a downturn in success because everybody else rose up around them to give more money? Would you think that Mizzou would raise $100 million more than Nebraska would? Would you think that South Carolina would raise $230 million, almost double, more than double what Nebraska put up? I would find that hard to believe without having the numbers in front of me, staring at them going, well, wait a second. Clemson is doubling up Nebraska. South Carolina is doubling up Nebraska. Kansas, for basketball, is doubling up Nebraska. Michigan State raised $200 million more in 17 years than Nebraska did. I can't help but notice that Michigan State has played in the college football playoff and played in New Year's Six bowl games more frequently than Nebraska during that time. And I don't know if maybe it's just one of those things that Cornhusker fans don't know exists. That, hey, you're in the same ballpark as Georgia Tech and NC State in booster donations and contributions to the athletic program. But I lean towards a couple of wrong coaching hires leads to just pure apathy and indifference to supporting an athletic program. Because there's more than just one variable at play here. You can sit here and say, well, the economic downturn of 2008 and then 2020. You can say that maybe the Nebraska athletic director is not a fundraiser as much as it's important at Kansas and Louisville. And those very well could be valid arguments. But I think when you go down this list of, okay, look at all of this money and then look at success, compare it to success. And again, I don't think it's just necessarily by football. For instance, Kansas and Louisville are 19 and 20 in the top athletic donations and contributions. Louisville has been good-ish on the gridiron. Got a Heisman Trophy winner, and that certainly helps. Papa John certainly helps. Kansas has been as bad as a Power 5 football team could be. And they're at 19 because their basketball program is elite. When you look at the top 20 and you equate, okay, where are the national champions coming from? They're not coming from 21st and below in college football. It's all in the top 20. When you get Florida, Georgia, LSU, Oklahoma, Florida State, Ohio State, Alabama, Clemson, all in the top 20, you got to go back a ways before you get to and University of Miami's not on this list because it's a private school. But when you look at national champions since the turn of the century, they're not coming from 31st. They're not coming from 48. They're coming from 1 through 16. And if you were to, again, man on the street interview, ask somebody, how many teams on average do you think have a real, true shot to win the national championship in college football every year? 16 is probably the number. They'd probably go, there's probably 16 teams in a given year that can win the national title. And then when you go, hey, where is the money coming from for schools that are getting really big numbers of donations in 17 years? How far down that list? It's about number 16. And so when you look at the 16 kind of best programs in 2023, it's an awful lot of them that are in the top 20 in donations and contributions. So did the success come first? Did the money come first? Money certainly helps. The money's always going to help. Being able to pay more for not just your head coach, but your coaching staff, your support staff, nutrition, strength and conditioning, all of those things, plus facilities, new uniforms, fancy travel. It all goes a long way in making you a top 15, 16 program in America. But is it the sole reason? Because you know what? I don't know how far outside the top 16 Ole Miss is. But Ole Miss is what, 35th on this list? They're not the 35th best program. On the flip side, Arizona State is the 40th highest grossing team, for lack of a better term, in contributions. Is Arizona State the 40th best program in America? Hell no. So I don't know that there's a correlation / causation, but I do wonder which came first. Because if you see even just a slight bit of success, I would not have guessed that Virginia is 13 on the list. But you get a college basketball national championship. Bronco Mendenhall came in there and kind of energized a fan base a little bit. It makes sense to me. And on the flip side, Nebraska being at 42nd makes sense to me, because if you think that your money's not going to make a difference between winning titles or finishing 3-9 with a bunch of 7-point losses, you're going to pony up? I wouldn't. Now, I don't have millions of dollars to just be dishing out. But at the same time, when I look at the list and go, okay, wait a second, not a lot of success from teams in the 42 range. The 41 through 50 is Iowa State, Nebraska, UCLA, Georgia Tech, NC State, Colorado, Oregon State, Minnesota, Maryland, and Memphis. And we'll talk about Memphis in a second. So in those 10 schools, do you think Nebraska wants to be associated with booster contributions with NC State, Oregon State, Minnesota, and Maryland? No, they don't. But there they are. So I wonder, just, is there a path out of that 42nd spot to Nebraska? I would think so. Because I'm certain Cornhusker fans don't want to see them finish. I know that they don't want to see 7-5 as like this plateau of success of like, hey, Matt Rule got us to 7-5, baby. I know they don't want that. I know they expect better than that, and that's okay. You should maybe expect better, depending on the school, than 7-5. But how much do these dollar figures matter to success? I think a little bit. I mentioned earlier, there are schools that have to just do more with less. Kansas State is on that list. Kansas State is on 33rd. I think Virginia Tech is in a similar spot. Virginia Tech is 34th. You got to do more with less. And the coaches that can do more with less, I'm sure, is not a fun place to be. Dave Clawson at Wake Forest, I'm sure, wishes he had unlimited resources. I'm certain he looks down the road at North Carolina and Mac Brown and thinks, I wish I had that. I'm sure he looks at Clemson and Florida State and says, I wish I could just go into my AD's office and say, I need XYZ. And he could go shake some hands and kiss some babies and get that done. But he probably can't. And that's just the reality of college football. It's just something you got to deal with. So in the top 50, there's only one group of 5 school, and it's Memphis. And I was somewhat surprised by that. But again, when you couple that in that 17-year stretch for college football, at least, and in basketball, Memphis has still been very good. In that stretch, John Calipari, Tubby Smith, and Penny Hardaway have been coaches at Memphis. Those are guys that are going to elicit donations and contributions. And in football, they had a very good run they had Mike Norvell there for a while. They had Justin Fuente before that. Memphis had a nice little run there in football. But if they were going to be the top group of 5 school, that surprised me a bit. And part of me is like, okay, there are some private schools in group of 5, like for instance, SMU. Does SMU bring in more booster contributions than Memphis? Probably. I would say Wake Forest and Duke also are on this list, but they're Power 5. There are just some schools that Boise State, I would have thought would have been right there on the cusp of being in the top 50, but Memphis is the only one. And when you look at the idea of the Big 12, now I think is probably off the table for Memphis, but Memphis is outspending some Power 5 schools, or I guess not outspending, out boostering Power 5 schools. How much does that matter? How much should that matter? I don't know. It's a decent media market with Arizona State, Utah, and Colorado joining the Big 12. I imagine that that's off the table if UConn and Gonzaga are not on the table for Memphis. Kind of stuck in no man's land. I think geographically they make perfect sense for the Big 12. Makes perfect sense. but I think it's probably dead unless the ACC, Big 12, Pac or ACC, Big 12, SEC, and Big 10 decide, hey, we're all going to get to 24 teams. All right, that's all we're going to get to is 24. I don't think that that's likely. But Memphis being at number 50 surprised me. 170 million bucks they've brought in 17 years, which isn't a lot in the grand scheme of things. But when you're trying to will your program into Power 5 status, I think every dollar counts. Every dollar matters. And I think they've been kind of baseline, like pretty good in football, pretty good in basketball, and you get rewarded with that in donations. But at the same time, if you want a view of how uneven the playing field is, in 17 years, Oregon brings in $969 million. That's tops. $969 million. And tops in group of 5 is $170 million, at least in public schools. 170. 969 versus 170. And I don't mind the uneven playing field because it's never been even, and to pretend that it has is disingenuous. But when it hits you smack dab in the face, when you have to confront that the best one of the quote-unquote smaller schools has done is $170 million, which is $25 million less than Maryland. It does make you think a little bit of when you subscribe to the theory that there are some schools who got to do more with less in the Power 5, and then everybody in the group of 5 has to do with significantly less. They have to deal with and get by with and succeed with significantly less by a wide margin, where Memphis is $100 million less than Mississippi State or Arizona State, or 25 million from the lowest Power 5. It's a tough spot to be in. And yet there are guys who find success. And I think we should tip our hats to them. So we'll do that throughout the college football season on the Daily Huddle. This has been today's edition of the Daily Huddle. Thank you so much for giving us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. I'm Garrett Seawright. You can find me at Garrett Seawright on Twitter. If you can hit the subscribe button, give us a thumbs up on the video, or give us a 5-star review, however it is you're listening to the podcast. We certainly appreciate it. We'll catch you tomorrow with another edition of the Daily Huddle. See ya.